Setting up ADFS. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget we're going to walk through the installation procedure for the ADFS role on Windows Server. I'm also going to show you how you can configure the ADFS service and get it all set up with your service account and your service communication certificate. I'm on the server that I'm going to use to install or host my ADFS service, and this just happens to be the domain controller for my domain that I'm authenticating against as well. That's a perfectly acceptable and reasonable thing to do. If you don't want to dedicate an entirely new computer to hosting ADFS, you can install it alongside your domain controller. Not a problem. Now, the first thing I need to do before I can install ADFS is set up what's called a service account. And the service account is going to be nothing more than a user that the ADFS service runs under on the local system. So I'm actually going to come into Active Directory Administrative Center, and I'm going to walk through this very quickly, how to create a new service account user here. This is actually covered in depth in Windows Server Administration. The courses that we have here at CBT Nuggets 410 and 411, the awesome Garth Schulte and James Conrad, cover this in a lot more detail, but it's not very complex if you've never done it before. I'm simply creating a new user account. I'm going to call it the ADFS service. And that is going to run right here inside of my local directory so that the ADFS service has a security context to run under. One really important thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I set the password to never expire, because a user will not be logging in interactively with this account. I don't want the password expiring on me behind the scenes. And that's all I need to do. Simply create this account. The other thing that I need to set up for this account is I need to give it the appropriate rights. And down here under Group Policy Management, I'm editing the default domain policy. But again, if you're not familiar with this, 7410 and 411, the courses here at CBT Nuggets, will cover everything that I'm doing here. I just have to grant this account two rights. I have to allow it to log on as a batch job, and I need to enable it to log on as a service down here. So having done that, my service account is ready to go, and now I can load the ADFS role on this server. That's going to be done right back here if we come to Dashboard, Add Roles and Features. This is the same process you would go through to add any role or feature to a Windows server. In my case, I am going to add the server role Active Directory Federation Services. And it's very easy to do. I'm just going to step through the wizard and let it install it as it would with the default settings, the default installation. One neat thing that happens here during the results page is I can export the configuration settings, and I can actually get a deployment configuration template, a .xml file, and that in turn can be used with PowerShell in order to script out this deployment or the add of this role onto a service. So that's an important thing to know about there. Now, once the role has finished installing, you'll have this dialog box right here, and notice the link Configure the Federation Service on this server. Getting ADFS installed is a two-tier process. First, you have to install the role, and then you have to configure the service. And you can do that by clicking this link right after you're done installing it. Or if you come down here to your server roles and look at your local server, and select ADFS on the left-hand side here, you see I have this little box up here telling me, hey, it has not been configured yet. I click More, and it says I need to configure the Federation service. I can click this link, and it's going to launch the ADFS configuration wizard, which I'll use to configure the Federation service. Now, I'm only going to go through this once, but I want you to take note of one item down here. Select an option below. I can either create the first server or add a Federation server to the Federation server farm. Creating the second, third, fourth, etc. server in a Federation farm is exactly the same as the process we're going to go through to create the first one. So it's important to know that when you want to add a second server to your ADFS farm, you're just going to choose that second option and then walk through this entire configuration process, just like we're getting ready to do here. But for now, this is only the first server in my farm, so I will leave it on that first option. It needs an account to perform this configuration. I'm going to use my current administrator user that I'm logged in as. That's not a problem. And I need to specify my service properties, which include both my SSL certificate and my Federation service name. Now, it's really important that these match up, and we talked about the SSL certificate when we were preparing our environment for ADFS. The SN on that certificate has to match the Federation service name. So for the Federation service name, it's actually going to extract it from the certificate that I use here. I've got a certificate built. I created one, requisitioned one, and it should be here in Documents, ADFS cert. And there we went. It extracted adfs.cbtoffice.com. I can give it a display name. This is just a generic. I'll call it ADFS CBT Nuggets. And click Next. And that will get my certificate installed and located on the local machine, ready to use with ADFS. Now I need to specify my service account. This is the service account that I just created. And notice up here that you can create a group managed service account as well, but the KDS root key has not been set yet. Again, don't worry about that. If you want to know more about that stuff, check out 70-411 where that's covered in depth. But I'm just going to use the regular service account that I created a few moments ago. The last thing that I need to do here is specify a database. ADFS has to store some local settings and some configuration, and I've got two different options here. The first one, which we're going to use in this nugget, is just to create an internal database here on the Windows Server. This is basically just a small local database. I could also specify an SQL Server database, and that has a couple of unique advantages. There's a couple of reasons why I'd want to do that, even though it's more complicated. Number one, that would separate my ADFS server from my database so that the ADFS server could fail independently of the database. Using the internal database here on this ADFS server means that if this server fails, the database goes with it. Another good reason to use an SQL Server database is if you do plan to have more than one ADFS server on your farm, all of the ADFS servers can reference a single SQL Server database, and they will all have read and write access to that database. If I create a Windows internal database, every server is going to have its own copy of the database, and it's going to be read-only on every server except for this one, except for the first one in the farm. And that means, again, if this server fails for whatever reason, I've got to grab one of those other servers and sort of promote it up to be the quote-unquote first server so that its Windows internal database then can be read and write as well. As it stands, I'm just going to leave it as a Windows internal database because I'm not going to go through the exercise of creating an entire farm here inside of this nugget. Once that's complete, I can review all of my options, and I have another really unique button down here at the bottom, View Script. This is going to show me the PowerShell script that would perform the exact same configuration that we just performed. So notice it is install-ADFS farm. That is the PowerShell command. Here is my certificate thumbprint. I've imported the certificate into my service, so I just need to reference the thumbprint and it can find it. There's my display name right there. There is the service name and the service account credential, which I used the get credential to extract inline, in stream. I could also populate that with real credentials if I knew what those credentials were inside of my script. So that's really useful, really handy to go through this process in the GUI, to click the View Script button to get the PowerShell version of how you would do this. I'm just going to let the GUI finish it though here. It runs a prerequisite. It says they've all passed. I click Configure, and it's going to configure my ADFS server for me. And after a few minutes of installing, I can see that it was successfully configured. I now have ADFS installed and running on this server. We are good to go here. In fact, on the left-hand Server Manager menu, there is my ADFS menu where I can perform different tasks. When I need to manage ADFS, I can pull down the Tools menu up here, and I now have an ADFS management option underneath my tools. And here's my entire ADFS server. One important thing that we want to point out here, if you expand the service node on the left-hand side and choose certificates, here is my token signing and my service communication certificate. And you know what? Certificates have an expiration date. This one's only good until 2019. If I wait until that certificate expires, I'm going to lose my federation. So one important maintenance task is you need to make sure that before that expiration date comes, you launch this management page here and you choose Set Service Communication Certificate over on the right, and you choose a new certificate with a later expiration date. So you don't want your certificates to expire on you, but that's okay. ADFS makes it really easy to update them with a new certificate when you need to. So that concludes this nugget on setting up ADFS, Active Directory Federation Services. You're probably thinking it was pretty easy to do, and you're right. It is a fairly simple operation. It's mostly wizard-driven, and it's a two-tier process. One, you install the ADFS role on your server, and two, you configure the ADFS server. The only additional complication is that you need to set up a service account inside of Active Directory that ADFS can run under, a security context for ADFS. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.